I'm delighted to see you all here. Thank you for being here. This is a marvelous occasion. So let me sort of set a little frame for the evening. In 1996, Norman and Florence Brody established a public policy forum here at the School of Public Policy. And what they wanted was to provide in-depth discussion of important issues of our time. Not in a classroom, but in a forum where we could have a dialogue. And so over the decades, we've had important speakers come from a variety of worlds: the media, deliberative bodies, academic, government officials. So who were the Brodys? Because everybody talks about the Brody scholars, the Brody board, the Brody events. The Brodys were real people. They were people who cared about public policy. Florence was an alum of this university, and Norman, her husband, said that he was an alum by marriage. Husbands get that chart. Well, today their son Bill and his wife Susan and a daughter Deidre Lipsicus are still at the helm, along with Bill's sister Sherry Brodner and her partner Bonnie. They could not be with us tonight, but send their wishes for us to have a good evening. So fast forward, Dinor comes to my house and says, "Betty, I'd like you to be the Brody Scholar for the Brody Professor, and I am deeply honored to serve in that capacity, and we've been doing it for a while." And prior to that, Professor Brezhnev was the Brody Scholar before me. So in 2017, we started with the idea that I would be assisted by a Brody Scholar, and every year we have had a Brody Scholar who assists not with the work of the board. This is work, but assist with a board, and the Brody Scholar heads the board and works with me. And I want to recognize that our second Brody Scholar is here tonight, Samantha Scheimer. Delighted to have you back, Sam. Sam is now with the Institute of Peace, and we're so happy to have you here. And this year's Brody Scholar, Javier de Leon, will be assisting tonight with the Q&A, so you will get to meet him as well. And he and the board, and board members are sprinkled among you, have had the opportunity to lay out this program, and indeed lay out the program for the whole year, which is a very active program. So it is my honor now to introduce our dean, who really doesn't need an introduction. We see him on a regular basis, but sometimes we take the folks we see every day for granted. So let me just tell you a little bit about Bob. You know, he came to us having served as the assistant secretary for the assistant to the Secretary General, get that one out, for strategic planning, and listen to what his jurisdiction was. Counterterrorism, peace building, women and children's health, a subject near and dear to my heart, sustainable energy, food and nutrition, institutional innovation, public and private partnerships, and climate change. Prior to that, Bob was at the Kennedy School of Government and the Council on Foreign Relations and held senior positions in government. So it was a great honor that I introduce you again to your dean, who will introduce our speaker for the evening, Bob.
Thank you, Betty, and thank you all for coming this evening. You are in for a treat. Our guest tonight, Ambassador John J. Sullivan, has a CV that is about this thick, so I'm not going to read it to introduce him tonight. Suffice it to say that Ambassador Sullivan, while very well known as an ambassador, distinguished ambassador of the United States to Russia from 2019 to 2022, a rather crucial time in U.S.-Russian relations. He is one of us. He is a lawyer by training, but he is the ultimate public servant. He has served not only as Deputy Secretary of State, Deputy Secretary of Commerce, General Counsel of the Department of Commerce, Deputy General Counsel of the Department of Defense. And I learned just a few minutes ago that he clerked for Associate Justice Souter at the Supreme Court and met Thurgood Marshall while he was clerking for Justice Souter. That one I didn't see on your resume, but coming into the Thurgood Marshall building tonight, he said, "I'm curious about this naming here. I met him, and not everyone who walks into this building has met Thurgood Marshall, so I think we may want to hear a little bit more about that tonight, Ambassador. But I call him one of us because his distinguished service is not only in and out of government, but there is a thread that runs through it, that he has served the United States with distinction, has used his legal skills, his political skills to advance the cause of public service. And it is with great pleasure, Ambassador, that I welcome you here tonight. Our students are very interested not only in international affairs, but in leadership. And I would consider you an exemplar in both. Thank you for...
Thank you, Dean Orr, Professor Duke, for that warm welcome. I'm thrilled to be here, to be with you here tonight. I consider myself a neighbor. I've lived in Bethesda, not that far from here, for 32 years. And for most of that time, about half of that time I was working in federal government, and the other half of that time I was practicing law at a law firm where I count as among my colleagues Professor Sue Schwab, who was so well known to everybody here at the school. Sue is an old and dear friend. We have a limited amount of time tonight, and there are so many issues I'd like to talk about with you, but I want to talk about what is of interest to you. So let me start with what I assume is at the front of everyone's mind, which is Russia, Putin's war against Ukraine, and what the heck is going on in our relationships with Russia, what just happened in Riyadh, what are the prospects for some sort of solution to this grievous problem, festering wound on the continent of Europe, which is Putin's war against Ukraine. I'll start with a couple of basic premises, and it's maybe by way of introduction and context. Why do I presume to talk to you tonight about about Russia? I don't speak the language. I used to get asked that when I was going through the confirmation process, and as a wise guy Irishman from Boston, I would answer with it, well, do you speak Russian? And I'd say niet, with a very good Russian accent. I'm not a Russian historian. I'm not unlike the number 2 official at the embassy when I was ambassador, our deputy chief of mission, Bart Gorman, had a PhD in Russian literature from the University of Southern California. So why do I have the nerve to come here and talk to you about Russia? Well, first, I base my remarks on 2 things. First, what I observed as ambassador for 3 years. I was, in a sense, given my lack of expertise in Russia, I was, in effect, to paraphrase Mark Twain's novel, a Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's court, in Vladimir Putin's Kremlin. What did I see while I was there? Second, while I was ambassador, the first major thing that happened when I was ambassador was the pandemic. And there was a pretty significant lockdown in Moscow that started at the end of March, just months. I was confirmed in December of 2019. I arrived, and within 3 or 4 months, there was a significant lockdown that meant that I couldn't go to in-person meeting with Russian government officials or Russians generally, because not only did I need to comply with the lockdown for as long as it lasted, which wasn't that long, but also I needed to maintain my health. I needed to, I was advised by our medical team at the embassy and had to be cautious. So I had a lot of time on my hands. And what did I do with that time? I lived, in effect, in the station. And for those of you who know what I'm talking about, the CIA, their offices at an embassy is called the station. The head of the station chief, is a senior CIA officer, is publicly identified to the host government and to the public generally. He and I were, as we described ourselves, geographic bachelors. My family was here. His family was here. Both of us had families back here in the United States, and we were alone. I spent hours every day, day after day, for almost a year and a half, getting a PhD in Putin and Putin's Russia from the U.S. intelligence community, and from one of the best professors I can think of, who was our station chief. And when I tell you he is an extraordinary person, I hope prove it to you by just citing one fact. Give you just a quick bit of background. He was station chief for the United States, for the CIA, in Amman, Jordan, Beijing, China, and Moscow. He speaks fluent Arabic, Mandarin, and Russian. He's an American, and English is his first language, but the first foreign language he learned was Russian. While studying in Russia, wrap your mind around this, while studying in Russia at Moscow State University, he learned Mandarin in a class at Moscow State University with Russian students from a Russian professor speaking Russian. Think about that for a sec. That's pretty darn hard. This guy is extraordinary. He was my professor, and the materials for the course were provided by the U.S. intelligence community. I'm pretty confident in what I'm telling you tonight about Putin and about his war and the prospects for peace and a settlement. First, the most important things to know. Russia considers the United States its enemy. That's Putin's word, not mine. Russia is at war with the United States. It's a hybrid war, but it's not name calling. It's not. It's serious. He means it, and you have to understand that. He's launched this aggressive war, and that's a term of art among lawyers, particularly international lawyers. It's an aggressive war is a war crime. It's a leadership war crime. There have been very few prosecutions for waging aggressive war in history. Most of them, virtually all of them, focused on Nazi defendants prosecuted at Nuremberg for starting the Second World War on September 1st, 1939. The most senior 11 Nazi German leaders who survived the war were tried at Nuremberg. All of them were convicted of multiple crimes. The first crime was aggressive war, crime against peace. Second crime was basic war crimes, what we would consider war crimes that had been well established for a long time, including before World War II, executing POWs, executing civilians, executing the Nazis, the Waffen-SS, executing American POWs at Malmedy. War crimes. That's the second charge. And then the third was crimes against humanity, which is the Holocaust. And then the fourth was conspiracy to commit the first four. The first crime charge, though, was aggressive war, was launching a war against Poland on September 1st, 1939, without justification or just cause. And I lay out in my book, making a comparison between how the Germans justified invading Poland with how Putin has justified invading Ukraine. This is a war crime, and it's not. It is a leadership crime, And you have to understand that as well. There aren't, well, on the one hand, on the other hand, well, this country misbehaved, this country, that's, in my opinion, and it's only my opinion, but it's an informed opinion, that's the equivalent of saying, the Poles were really asking for it on September 1st, 1939. Now, you have to put the Holocaust, all that happened after, crying havoc and unleashing the dogs of war, all that happened in the Second World War, that grotesque history of the Holocaust, etc. But if you just focus on how the war starts, it tracks almost verbatim how Putin started the war, his justification for it, etc. I'm happy to talk about that as we go forward this evening, because I think the historical parallels are pretty compelling. So he considers Russia an enemy of the United States. He's waged an aggressive war against Ukraine in pursuit of an imperial agenda to restore what in his mind is the rightful place of Russia, the Russian Empire, in the world. And you've heard that said a lot. What does it mean in practical terms? It means this. Putin has said, and I'll use Putin's words as much as I can. I won't put words in his mouth. I'll tell you what I believe he thinks. Putin has said, I'm sure you've all seen this, that the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century was the downfall, the demise of the Soviet Union. And what does he mean by that? It's really important to understand this, to understand what his imperial quest is about. The great catastrophe was not the demise of Soviet communism. Putin is not a communist. It's hard to be a communist and be the richest person in the world with $1 billion palace in Sochi, but I digress. He's not a communist. He repeats, this is a common expression in Russia, and Putin has said this, and I think he believes it. If you're not nostalgic for how we lived in Soviet days, you don't have a heart. But if you want to return to Soviet communism, you don't have a brain. So he's not a communist. What he is he has this vision of the Russian Empire, which dates back centuries. Think Peter the Great. And the Soviet Union is just part of that. In his mind, the Soviet Union and Russia are interchangeable. They're completely different countries. The scale of the Soviet Union, 15 republics, 350 million people, as opposed to the Russian Federation, roughly 140, 145 million people. Much smaller, not the same country, but in Putin's mind, it's the same country. And what's the most important thing about Russia and really his vision from Moscow? What's the great catastrophe? Losing control over that empire, whether it's the Soviet Empire, the Russian Empire under the Tsars, losing control from the center. And by the center, Putin means Moscow. Moscow must control all of the lands that constitute the so-called Ruski Mir, the Russian world. When the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed, here's what happened. The international boundary of the Soviet Union, this enormous geographic economic colossus, disappeared. The internal boundaries of the Soviet Union that separated the Soviet republics became international borders. So the border between Ukraine and Russia, which was a legal, depicted legally on maps of the Soviet Union, but it wasn't an international border. It meant Moscow, the center, could control all that happens in Kiev and in Ukraine, or the Russian pronunciation, in Kiev. So control by Moscow, control by the center, whether it's the Tsar, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, or the President of the Russian Federation. The demise of the Soviet Union meant the demise of control by the center, by Moscow. That's what Putin means to restore. This has been his objective in life, his professional life, his whole life, since the end of the Cold War, since he returned from Dresden, where he was Lieutenant Colonel Putin in the KGB in Dresden. Oh, by the way, if he really were a superstar in the KGB, he wouldn't have been Lieutenant Colonel Putin in Dresden. He would have been Colonel Putin in East Berlin. But he's Lieutenant Colonel Putin, comes back, returns to his hometown, what had been Leningrad when he was born, now becomes St. Petersburg, restored to the name of the founder of that capital and really the Russian Empire, Peter the Great. And he sets about this quest, along with others, Russian nationalists, to restore what was lost, the Russian Empire. The United States is the villain in all of this. We triumphed over the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We're responsible. Putin now says that the United States started a war against Russia. This is why the United States is the enemy. A war against Russia in Ukraine. This isn't Putin's war. This is the United States has started a war. This is the Russian narrative, Putin's narrative. The United States started a war against Russia in Ukraine. Russia's response was the special military operation. This is how he thinks, and he means it. It's counterfactual, but he means it. This is what to his core what he is about. This is restoring Ukraine to its rightful place in the Ruski Mir. And what is the core of that Russian Empire? It's Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. There is already a so-called union state that unites Belarus with Russia. The center, Moscow, controls Minsk. Yeah, Lukashenko has some nominal independence, but not really. It's a union state. Russia controls it. Moscow, the center, controls it. That is originally what Putin wanted in Ukraine, in my opinion. If given this proposition before the war started, if you had said to Putin, you can have Ukraine become the third member of the so-called Triune Rus, the Ruski Mir, Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine. There won't be any membership of Ukraine in NATO or the EU. There will be a three-country union state. You will control from the center, from Moscow, Ukraine, but you won't absorb Ukraine into the Russian Federation, just as you haven't absorbed Belarus into the Russian Federation. If you had told Putin that, I'm pretty confident in telling you I believe he would not have invaded Ukraine. There wouldn't have been a need, just as he hasn't invaded Belarus. When Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, had serious problems in August and September of 2000, after he was reelected on August 9th, 2020, 2020, not 2000, 2020, August 2020, the Russians didn't need to invade. They sent the FSB, they provided some support to Lukashenko, and Lukashenko maintained his control, nominal though it is. That's basically would have been Putin's vision for Ukraine. He wasn't going to achieve that because the government, so it's a hypothetical bargain. He wasn't going to be able to achieve that because the Ukrainians resisted. The Ukrainians weren't going to surrender. They weren't going to collapse after Putin had seized Crimea, after he and the Russian military had infiltrated the eastern Donbass in 2014-15. The Ukrainians pushed back hard, supported by the West. So Putin is frustrated. Fast forward to 2021-2022. He is bound and determined in his lifetime to restore Ukraine to its orbit in the Ruski Mir. And he's going to do it through this special military operation. I'm convinced that when Biden met with Putin, and I was with Biden when they met in June of 2021, June 16th, that by that date, Putin had already decided he was going to have to invade Ukraine to accomplish his goals for that country, restoring control by Moscow over Ukraine. I don't think, I've said elsewhere, I don't think Putin was deterrable at this point. He was already determined he was going to accomplish what he needed to accomplish. And it was going to take an invasion. He thought it was going to be over in 2 weeks. We're now approaching the 3-year anniversary, and he's not close to accomplishing his objectives. What he's done, however, is absorb a fairly substantial, almost a fifth of Ukraine's territory has been absorbed into the Russian Federation legally, well, under Russian law and the Russian Constitution. And in Putin's mind, that territory, Crimea, those oblasts in the Donbass, that they had sham elections. Russians claimed that the population voted to be absorbed by the Russian Federation. Putin had the Russian Constitution amended in 2020 to limit the ability of any Russian leader to alienate Russian land that is part of the Russian Federation. So it's part of Russia now. Having sacrificed hundreds of thousands of Russian lives, soldiers, to conquer that territory and absorb it, he will never, repeat, never surrender that territory. He will never compromise on his war aims, which are, there are two, as he phrases it, to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. So denazify means removing, because they call the government in Kyiv a Nazi conspiracy. Put to one side the fact that the democratically elected president of Ukraine is a Jew whose grandfather fought for the Red Army against the Nazis. Again, facts get in the way of the narrative. Denazify Ukraine and demilitarize Ukraine. Ukraine can never join NATO. The Ukrainian military has to be reduced to basically a constabulary force. Consider Belarus. The Belarusian military is tiny. Belarus has an enormous security service. It's maintained the KGB acronym. It's the BKGB. Their military is tiny, which is why, among the reasons that Belarus hasn't participated militarily in the special military operation. They've just provided the territory and some of the logistical hubs for the Russians to continue the special military operation. So, he's got these war aims. He's not going to compromise. What can we do? I've maintained, I outline in my book what I believe needs to be the U.S. approach to this aggressive war that Putin launched, which is a form of 21st century containment of Russia and Putin's imperial ambitions. Because I guarantee, again, my opinion, I guarantee his imperial ambitions do not end at Ukraine. He will continue this fight even if there is a ceasefire, even if it's a long-term ceasefire. He will never compromise his war aims. He can't do it. He won't do it. So we are looking at a situation now. The new administration wants, I can't disagree with this premise, wants the bloodshed to end. Who doesn't want it to end? But the problem is we're dealing with an enemy, Putin's term, not mine, but I agree that Putin considers us an enemy. We have to go into negotiations, and I put negotiations in quotes, and I can explain why. I believe that negotiating with Putin is not possible. What we can do is, and I believe we should talk to Putin. We should tell him things and listen to what he tells us. But negotiating the way we think of negotiating in the West, of good faith gestures and exchange, he is not going to do it. He does not operate that way. He will give the appearance of doing so. He will say he wants to negotiate, but he's a liar. The Russians told us, the United States, in writing, days before the special military operation started, the foreign minister in writing to Secretary Blinken that Russia would not invade Ukraine. They cannot be trusted. The old Reagan's quote of the Russian maxim, trust but verify, that's quaint. That's a quaint historical anachronism, completely inapplicable to 2025 and Russia today. So the most important thing for the new administration is to understand the enemy that we're dealing with. And I'll conclude with this thought, and then I'd like to open it to questions. There are a lot of other things I can cover just on Russia, Ukraine. But think about this. We talk about negotiating in particular with Putin. We saw that President Trump spoke by phone with Putin. He sent his special representative, Mr. Witkoff, to Moscow, and Witkoff brought back with him a wrongfully detained American, a person that I knew as ambassador, Mark Fogel, who taught at the Anglo-American school, the K through 12 school affiliated with the US and UK embassies in Moscow. Fogel was arrested in August of 2021 for possessing trace amounts of medicinal marijuana. The same charge that Brittany Griner was arrested 6 months later in mid-February of 2022, right before the start of the special military operation. Trace amounts, not enough even for, effectively one dose, just trace amounts. Brittany Griner got 9 years in a labor camp, charged with a massive narcotics conspiracy because she mistakenly left a cartridge in her luggage transiting Moscow. She got sentenced to 9 years in a labor camp, wrongfully detained. Fogel had even less, an even tinier amount. He got 14 years in a labor camp. He was a hostage among many Americans who've been taken hostage in Russia. The Russians take American hostages, among other reasons, because the United States has prosecuted Russians for a variety of crimes, up to and including espionage. We often think of trading spies. Now we're trading common criminals, Russian criminals, drug dealers, arms dealers, Victor Boot. And there's a guy named Vinnik, who a Russian, serious, high-level cyber criminal responsible for hundreds of millions of dollars in damages to the United States. We, the United States, for years worked hard to have him extradited from Greece. The Russians put enormous pressure on the Greek government. Our NATO ally in Athens extradited him to the United States despite all the threats, all the pressure from Russia. Vinnik pleads guilty, is sentenced, a lengthy sentence, and is incarcerated in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. The Russians offer Fogel, who's wrongfully charged and convicted, what he did would not be a crime in the United States. I get it, the Russians can define their crimes. But understand, this wouldn't be a crime in the United States, but to sentence him to 14 years in a labor camp, I worked for months to have him declared by the U.S. government wrongfully detained, with all that implies. The White House says, and this is what bothers me, the White House has presented what happened, the exchange, Fogel for Vinnik, as a good faith gesture by Russia, by Putin. It's as if Fogel had gone on a ski trip in Siberia, got caught in an avalanche, broke a leg. The Russians rescued him and returned him to the United States, and there was no trade. That is a completely false narrative. Fogel was a hostage for years who would have stayed planted in a Russian labor camp unless the United States traded a serious cyber criminal that we expended a lot of capital, the Department of Justice, under our extradition treaty with the Greeks, convincing the Greeks to extradite him, I don't know whether the Greeks will ever extradite another Russian to the United States. Why would they extradite somebody to the United States? So the United States could then in turn get something we want from the Russians. The Greeks will do that themselves. We're not going to give the next Russian criminal to you. We'll send him back to Russia and demand that the Russians trade something to us. So my fear, my concern is that we're approaching these negotiations with the Russians and doing so and talking about good faith gestures and the relationship between the two sides. This is a country that is an enemy of the United States. The Russian government has killed or wrongfully incarcerated more Americans than just about any other country in the world in the last 20 years. So we have to approach our counterparty realistically and understand that this party is only going to respond to pressure and a continuation of the sanctions and support for Ukraine that we've undertaken for the last 3 years. Relaxing now, particularly when the Russian economy is under such stress, there's a reason why the Russians are jubilant today. Ecstatic is not an overstatement with how the new administration has approached these talks with Russia, with Putin. So my hope is that serious people, and I know that he is a serious person. I worked with him very closely particularly when I was deputy secretary, even as ambassador with Senator Rubio. When I was deputy secretary, I had most engagement with him when I was deputy secretary of state, when he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. A lot of engagement with him. He was a senior member of the committee. I had even more engagement with him, interestingly enough, with him from his perch on the Senate Intelligence Committee when I was ambassador in Moscow. He knows the challenges we face. I trust him, and my hope is that he will guide this administration in its negotiations with the Russians to an end, however long it takes, and it may take a long time for what the administration wants, which is a just and fair solution. It will take a long time and a lot more pressure on Russia. With that, I will turn it over to you for questions. Anything you'd like to ask me about?
Thank you again for your thoughtful remarks, Ambassador. Before I open it up to the floor, I had a couple pre-submitted questions that I want to go ahead and ask you. So the first question is, can you speak a bit more in detail about serving as Secretary of State in an interim capacity in the first Trump administration?
Yeah, boy, it gave me new respect for all of those people, whether it's in any administration who serve in an acting capacity. It's not easy. And particularly as Secretary of State, it's rare for that office to be held by someone on an acting basis for more than a day or a week. And I served for almost 6 weeks as the acting secretary. If you look back in time over our whole history, you have to go back to sometime in the 19th century for another example of an acting Secretary of State serving that long. Why? Because the United States needs, as its chief diplomat, the president needs somebody who has the respect of foreign governments and foreign leaders having been confirmed by the Senate. Yes, I could make decisions. I could sign necessary legal documents. I had the legal authority, but the real authority, the real imprimatur of presidential nomination, confirmation by the Senate to be Secretary of State, that's not something you can make up. And I was supported by, I wrote about this in my book, by a person I considered my mentor over a number of years, Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense for the first 2 years of the Trump administration. He would call me. I worked very closely with him. He brought me into the Trump administration after the election, but during the transition when Trump had picked then General Mattis to serve as Secretary of Defense. Mattis called me and asked me if I would work for him at the Defense Department, and I was honored to say yes. I won't bore you with the details, but a trade was made between Tillerson and Mattis, and I wound up becoming Deputy Secretary of State. But I had a history with Mattis, and I worked very closely with him when I was Deputy Secretary. When I became Acting Secretary, he'd call me every day at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. just to check in on me. We talked about, the Dean mentioned leadership. Mattis's leadership, when I think of the quintessential leader, it's Jim Mattis. And not just because he's a Marine general. It's because of who he is and how he comports himself, how he treats other people, what he demands quietly, but what he expects of those who work with him. And the key test, in my opinion, of a real leader, and I saw this with Mattis, when the people who worked for and with him were terrified, not of Mattis, but of failing him, letting him down. Talked to Marines who served with him, talked to people who worked for him at the Defense Department. When you're a leader who commands that type of respect and commitment from your team, not by demanding it, but by earning it, and it's pervasive. And I saw it, as Acting Secretary of State, taking care of me, calling me, twice a day. Now, he is a former Marine 4-star. He's got views, and they are definite views on a lot of issues, and he had a lot of problems with the Department of State. Typical Defense Department, State Department. He had pardon me, I'm on a roll here. Let me finish my Mattis story. He had a list of problems with the Department of State that was as long as my arm. So Tillerson reached out to Mattis and said, can I make Sullivan Deputy Secretary? Mattis says yes. Oh, and by the way, Rex, you don't mind if I call John, and if I've got an issue with the state, I don't want to bother you with an issue. John can take care of it for me. You don't mind, right? Talk about leadership. This is a bureaucratic infighter par excellence, but not in a heavy-handed way. He or his chief of staff, or the deputy secretary of the, we would work through and there were a lot of serious issues. One example, the rules of engagement for the United States Navy in the Red Sea, in addressing threats posed by the Houthis in Yemen. Big policy issue today. It was a big issue in 2017-18. Final Mattis story. I'm about to conclude my tenure. Mike Pompeo is about to be confirmed as Secretary of State. And it was one of Mattis's issues, and it was just about to be teed up to be resolved. And I said to the secretary, I said, I really think I should leave this. Pompeo's going to get confirmed in 2 days. I shouldn't preempt the incoming secretary. I should let him decide it. And Mattis paused and said in his very soft voice, the way he speaks, particularly when he's really serious, he said, well, Mr. Acting Secretary, I think you need to act. Like, ooh, there was a pause. I go, ooh, wow. And having now experienced what it's like to not want to let Secretary Mattis, General Mattis down, I did, and explained it to Secretary Pompeo. But that's what it was like being acting secretary, and maybe a few insights on some leadership that I observed, positive leadership examples from my service in government.
Thank you. We'll go ahead and open it up to the floor. Dr. Gallagher.
So I'm Nancy Gallagher. I'm the director of the Center for International Security Studies here. And you're in, I think, quite a unique position to comment on a hypothetical, counterfactual question, right? Since you served as ambassador to Russia for both President Trump and President Biden.
Sure.
How, if at all, do you think events in Ukraine would have unfolded differently if Trump had won re-election? Do you think it would have made any difference, or do you think it was all basically driven by Putin's internal psyche?
So being a well-trained lawyer, my answer has to be it depends. But it really does depend on how we define what Putin's aim is. And this is why I said earlier, his aim originally was not a military conquest and absorption of territory from Ukraine. I am convinced that Putin, and he was willing to wait, that he could have achieved that in a second Trump term without having to invade Ukraine. That Ukraine would be undermined, its ability to resist. Putin, the Russian government, spent billions of dollars, not rubles, dollars, thousands of FSB officers the FSB is the principal successor to the KGB. When the KGB ceased to exist, there were two entities that grew out of it, a smaller foreign intelligence service and then the FSB, the Federal Security Service. The Federal Security Service is responsible for security in Russia and in the former Soviet republics, Russia's so-called near abroad. Give you a sense of scale. The FSB has somewhere between 350 and 400,000 officers. The FBI is less than 1/10 the size. With an institution that large, with its mission to focus on Ukraine, Putin sent in its so-called Section 5 of the FSB, this is my education in the CIA station, they sent, I write about this in my book, thousands of extra FSB officers starting in 2014. They already had thousands deployed in Ukraine. Putin spent billions, sent thousands more to prepare the battle space, to weaken Ukraine's ability to resist if war was ultimately necessary, and more generally weaken Ukraine's ability to resist what Putin was about, which was absorbing Ukraine back into this Ruski Mir control from the center. So my suspicion is that Putin would have went about his objective, at least at the start, in a second Trump term, with sort of what he's doing today, to undermine Ukraine and get the American president to divide NATO and sell Ukraine down the river.
Thank you so much for your time and insights tonight, Ambassador. My name is Connor Clark. Very DC cliche thing, obviously I'm not speaking for any entities I'm working for, but I am at the Department of State. Bit of a stressful time, been there less than 1 year. So anyway, I'm not gonna, brag or run down my own resume, but I am a Eastern Europe specialist myself, and I've also...
Are you in EOR?
H Bureau.
Okay.
Educators, yeah. So, dealing with Congress right now is also lots of fun. So, anyway, I was thinking about a common theme I've heard throughout my studies and experiences living in Russia. And that seems to be that there's this kind of balance between nationalist realism or realist nationalism in Russian strategic thought and diplomats, and that when you're at the negotiating table with them, that they have a realistic sense that they're not going to get everything they want, but they want to have Russia be that great power that other great powers have to take into account. They have to be welcomed at the table of great powers and not thought of as this European underdeveloped backwater. The idea of
As President Obama said, a regional power.
At the
Or
UN speech.
Senator McCain, a gas station with a nuclear weapon. Excruciatingly painful for Putin to hear that.
Yes. So I was curious if you had come across examples of that, proving true, they're realistic enough to not get everything they want, but national enough to believe they have to have that Russian quasi-imperial ego-soothe, or were there examples where that didn't turn out?
No,
Medvedev might be.
No, I think you may in fact be understating it, in the sense that the Russians, no matter what we needed to talk to them about, would always take the maximalist position and never retreat. I can cite examples, I cite some in my book, just on the operations of our embassy. It was always Russia that was demanding things from the United States, and anything the United States asked for in response was just an outrageous imposition on Russia. The most important lesson I learned, not long after I got to Moscow, ironically enough, from a Russian Orthodox bishop, was his advice to me was to never ask the Russians for anything. They will interpret it as weakness and they will dismiss you. Never ask them for anything. My strategy, and I came to learn the wisdom of that advice, and therefore my subsequent engagements with them, and I said this before when I talked about negotiating, there is no negotiating with them. If you thought your colleagues at the State Department, my friends and former colleagues there, you ask an American diplomat to start to frame an approach for the United States to negotiations, and with the interlocutor, the counterparty is Russia. It is the way we approach life, let alone our professional lives and professional negotiations, is so different from how the Russians do. You task the State Department to prepare for negotiations. They'll prepare lists of our demands, what the Russians want, and inevitably the icebreaker, the good faith gesture. First and most basic mistake we would make, characterizing what Putin did by releasing Fogel as a good faith gesture by Putin, that alone is a mistake, a public diplomacy mistake by the United States, among the reasons why the Russians are euphoric today. So my approach was always tell them things, more in sorrow than in anger, but tell them things. So, for example, we had trouble getting visas for American diplomats to come to Russia to staff, particularly to staff the consulates we then had in Vladivostok and Yekaterinburg. And I came in, and my goal was, what I wanted to do, if this were a normal negotiation, was to ask the Russians to say, look, you demand reciprocity in our diplomatic relations. You get X visas. We need X visas. So give me X visas. And that would have been asking for something. I approached it in the following way, and I had clearance from then Secretary Pompeo to do this. I said, we need X visas to operate, tell them things. We need X visas to operate our consulate in Yekaterinburg. You have a consulate in Houston. You also have a consulate in New York. If we don't get X visas to operate our consulate in Yekaterinburg, we will need to suspend operations. If we have to suspend operations, you will lose your consulate in Houston. They didn't like that. The consulate in Houston is very valuable to them, and people misunderstand why, right? I think I read about this in the book. If not, just give you an insight into how they operate. It's a common phenomenon that the Russians send diplomats around the world who are SVR officers, so intelligence officers, undeclared intelligence officers. They come to a country, they're accredited as a diplomat, as a trade specialist, an econ officer, etc. But they're really an officer in the SVR. Other countries with intelligence services do the same thing. Okay. They And one of my colleagues at the department, I can't take credit for this line, the Russians flood at least the United States with undeclared intelligence officers. And one of my colleagues once said, it's what you get when you select as president a KGB man. What is he going to use his embassies and his foreign ministry for? Foreign intelligence services. A European diplomat, small Eastern European country, said that in their country, in their capital, they refer to Russian diplomats, air quotes, as multifunctional diplomats. So here's what's interesting about Houston. It's why, you have to, it's complicated, and Russia is unlike any other enemy, if you feel uncomfortable saying that, adversary that the United States has. You ask the FBI, I think the Russians have 10, 12 diplomats in Houston. I don't think any of them are SVR officers. So why do they care and why do I care? Because you know where they send their foreign intelligence officers into Houston? To the Johnson Space Center, to Roscosmos, the NASA-Roscosmos relationship. Everything in Russia is or can be an instrument of the state. Aeroflot, it's an instrument of the FSB. Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, they send multifunctional cosmonauts. Why do they need Houston? Why do they need the consulate? They need a base of operations. They can't do things out of the Johnson Space Center. They need that consulate, the facility that they have built there, and they don't want to risk getting it closed, and they don't need to assign SVR officers to their consulate because they can slip in as many, I'm overstating, they can get the SVR officers they want into the United States, into Houston, through NASA, but they do need the consulate. So the Russians took this very seriously. If I had threatened their consulate in New York, they have their mission to the UN also in New York. Houston was valuable. Pompeo agreed, and we were going to close the Houston consulate. And then we have another country that we have, it presents a strategic challenge to the United States, the People's Republic of China. A very fraught relationship in the last several years, including in 2020, for entirely separate, unrelated reasons. We closed the PRC's consulate in Houston in October 2020. And Pompeo called me up and said, I realized I authorized you to go in and say this, but I just can't close 2 consulates in one city in 1 month. So we're going to have to wait. So he was going to do it in December. The election happens. December comes. The new administration, the transition team finds out, says, oh my God, we've got to put diplomacy first. Don't close the Russian consulate in Houston. And we didn't. And it's just one of a long list of examples I can cite to you where the Russians look at how we behave, how we comport ourselves. We threaten to close the Houston consulate and then don't follow through. We're our own worst enemy.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. So my question is about the current stage of the ongoing negotiation that's going to happen between Russia and United States. It's going to talk about Russia and Ukraine. U.S. follows the deterrent strategies, having peace through strength. But my question is, when Ukraine or the European Union is not invited into the table, does that make U.S. look strong at the cost of making Ukraine or EU look weaker in terms of positions of power? And if that happens, then even if the negotiation is a successful one, how much long-lasting can we hope for this? Is this going to kind of follow through even after the administration change, or in the middle?
Yeah, so great question. And It has been a standard talking point for the United States that we won't talk about Ukraine without Ukraine being present. That changed this week in Riyadh. One thing I've learned since February of 2022 is to not underestimate the Ukrainians. I, along with most people in the U.S. government, never thought that Ukraine was going to be able to survive the onslaught by the much larger Russian military, and they did. The Ukrainians aren't going to surrender. Whether the United States supports Ukraine or not, even if there's a ceasefire, they will. There is so much bad blood. I talk about, I don't know if I drew this comparison in my book, but I cite it often. I think of my families, my grandparents were from Ireland, and you think about the enduring, continuing hostility is a pretty significant understatement between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. What's happened between Russians and Ukrainians is going to make, it's going to be a much bigger, bloodier ulster on the continent of Europe. Ukrainians and Russians are going to be killing each other into the future, whether they're doing so through organized military actions or not. Think about there have been several Russian general officers who've been assassinated in Moscow by the SBU. I'm sure that it's the Ukrainian security services. The Ukrainians they're not going to give up. And so it's a mistake. And if the administration, the U.S. administration, wants an enduring peace that's going to last and be fair and just, obviously Ukraine has to be at the table. We've got a different question with, I would prioritize the Europeans as first NATO and then the EU. For our NATO allies, of course, we've got to include them. If we don't, if we blow up the NATO alliance, we will have handed Putin one of his principal objectives that he's sought since, well, the Soviet Union sought long before Putin became president of the Russian Federation. And what I would say to my colleagues, particularly those at the State Department, I'll come back to my World War II analogy. What we need to avoid is a Lavrov-Rubio pact that divides Ukraine. I mean, yes, it accomplished what, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939 did accomplish the short-term aims of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but at the expense of the Poles and the Baltic peoples, and ultimately the paper that the Germans signed, that Ribbentrop signed, was worthless. Just as anything Putin, he cannot be trusted. Anything they promise to do cannot be counted on. Just as the Germans signed that pact in the secret addendum in August of 1939. By June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa begins, and the Germans have invaded the Soviet Union. So my advice to the current administration and to Secretary Rubio, he has to implement, as Secretary of State, the president's policies. But as an American, and if he is concerned about his legacy, he should want to avoid a Lavrov-Rubio pact and what that will mean for him in history's judgment.
Dr. Duke.
You're very kind. Thank you. Thank you.
I join you, all of you, in thanking the ambassador for being with us this evening. It was a fascinating evening with a fascinating person, and his book is an absolutely fascinating read, Midnight in Moscow. So thank you for being here. Please join us for a reception downstairs. The ambassador will be here for a little bit longer. Please feel feel free to meet him and all of our guests. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you, Ambassador.